Hi everybody, how's it going? Jordan here again. This is the second of my two-part video series on the Thomas Piketty reading. This one is going to be changing gears a little bit from what you heard in the first one. So this one's going to be talking a little bit more about how Piketty's book is in conversation with the literary and philosophical readings of the course. So as I mentioned last time, this really isn't a economics class. Although we're interested in economics themes, it's ultimately an English course that's about a series of literary texts that are in conversation with economic problems. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about how Piketty himself thinks about literature and engages literature in his book. So one of the things you might have noticed is that Piketty expresses disappointment with a couple trends in his discipline of mainstream economics. On the one hand, he says that he thinks that economics has gone too far in becoming so highly schematic and mathematical in the way it is. Now, he's not opposed to quantitative methods, and obviously anyone who's read his book knows that he thinks they're absolutely essential. But he thinks that mainstream economics often abstracts away from cultural and historical specificity in a way that he thinks is detrimental. And then the second thing that he expresses disappointment with is the fact that questions of distribution have totally been sidelined. Economists aren't really thinking about how the production of a society gets distributed as much as they are in other things. I should issue a caveat before continuing that his book was published in 2013, and I think in those 7 years, a lot has happened in economics, and there's much more room for discussions of history, institutions, culture, and certainly discussions of inequality, which is basically a hot topic now. But I think his point still largely stands. But the things that Piketty takes issue with in economics, mathematical abstraction and the sidelining of distribution, they're relatively new in the history of economic thought. So the discipline that we call economics today was preceded by what was often called political economy, which is a more philosophical and literary discipline than its mathematical child. The people that you'll read next week, Smith, Bentham, Malthus, and Marx, they are interested in describing the empirical dynamics of the economy, but they combine these empirical claims with literary quotes, historical narratives, and claims about cultural specificity. Piketty sometimes seems to want to rejuvenate this older and interdisciplinary way of thinking about economic life. And to just give one quote, he says, film and literature are full of detailed information about the relative wealth and living standards of different social groups, and especially about the deep structure of inequality, the way it is justified, and its impact on individual lives. So basically, it seems like Piketty wants to take culture seriously. And I think that's true in two ways. On the one hand, he believes that questions of inequality can't be reduced to purely economic issues. A good discussion of this is his analysis of super managers as being at least partially culturally specific. It's much more common in the United States and in Britain. And then on the other hand, he wants to take the objects of culture as themselves valuable data for thinking about inequality, especially historical inequality. So, he wants to use literary texts as themselves saying something about inequality that's useful to us thinking about it. So in the spirit of that attitude, I've taken one of these big historical graphs about inequality and tried to map the readings of the course onto it. It's the left-hand end of each word that maps to the date. But I just wanted to go through a few of them. This is all the major readings, and just go through how they fit into this broad history of inequality. Basically, do something similar to what Piketty himself does, where he'll give you a historical description backed up by data, and then he will turn to an Austen novel or a Balzac novel as a way of illuminating what that historical dynamic might have been like for the people that were living in it and inhabiting it. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is this reversal that happens in the United States and the European wealth share in the 20th century. So I annoyingly can't use my mouse, so you'll just have to visualize it. But you see that the U.S. and the European lines both have a moment of crossing in the middle of the 20th century. So in the time of de Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, who you'll read, the United States was a sort of symbol of equality, not just in a political sense, because it was one of the first countries to expand the franchise to white men who were not property owners, and emphasis on the white part there and the men part. But for de Tocqueville, this was striking, and it was not just striking for its political reasons, but for economic reasons. He thought that the economy of the United States was related to this in an important way. Most notably, this is the one that people talk about so often, that is, if you were a white citizen in the United States, it was just much easier to become a landowner than if you were a white citizen of a European country, because land was abundant for obvious historical reasons relating to the depopulation of the Americas because of diseases and genocide of the indigenous inhabitants. There was much more land available for white non-big property owners to own themselves. And Tocqueville sees this as relating to the government of the United States. Moving forward a little bit to The Time Machine, this is H.G. Wells' famous early science fiction novel. It's pretty famous. You might, I think you'll probably enjoy it. Students tend to enjoy this novel. But it's coming right at the end of this moment of increase of inequality. So at the end of the 19th century, sometimes known as the Gilded Age, there's a lot of economic growth, but very disproportionate spreading of the gains of that economic growth. So The Time Machine, I think we can read it in many ways as sort of a extrapolation of what would happen if that trend continued. So like imagine if you can sort of imagine if those lines never actually hit a peak, they just kept going for forever and forever, and what sort of bizarre dystopian world would we be met with if inequality continued endlessly? And that's kind of what The Time Machine seems to be thinking about. Then I just wanted to draw your attention to two more novels that take place in the period of compression of wealth inequality. So Native Son, Richard Wright's novel, happens right in the midst of this compression. It's published in 1940, so World War II is about to start for the United States, and the Depression has been underway for a while. And the thing that is very valuable about this novel is that it draws our attention to the historical contingencies of inequality. So if you see a graph like this, you might think, oh, hey, in the middle of the 20th century, things are becoming more equal. This novel is about the specifically American way that the lines of inequality often fell on racial lines. It's about someone who lives in Chicago, and it's very interested in how race plays into the sorts of economic opportunities you have and outcomes that are possible for you. So it complicates this graph in many ways. And then lastly, I just wanted to point out Landscape for a Good Woman, which is a novel that's it's sort of a mixture of memoir and essay. And it's about someone who's reflecting on her mother's her relationship with her mother, who grew up in a very different period than she did in Great Britain. So her mother grew up before the establishment of the post-war welfare state, so before things like the National Health Service and this economic compression, and she grew up in the midst of it. So it's sort of thinking about how there are different experiences growing up in these two very different societies, one very unequal without a lot of social protections, one relatively more equal and with quite a few social protections, how this affects their experience. So I just wanted to dwell on the de Tocqueville for a little bit longer. So Piketty is really interested in this reversal. About the fact that, it was the case that Europe was the wildly unequal society and America was relatively more equal, and that now this seems to have switched. And like I said, this had to do with opportunities for ownership of specifically land. Land was the most important kind of thing you could own before, highly industrial societies. And because of the specific historical contingencies of the United States, white men could own land more readily than they could in Europe, where the ratio of population to land was much different. But the thing that's really striking for Piketty is the degree to which this has reversed in the 21st century. So now the United States is the highly unequal society relative to Europe. And the reasons for that, again, have to do with contingencies of history. So in the 20th century, the social democratic governments of Europe after World War II were just much more willing, for a variety of reasons that we don't really have time to go into, but were much more willing to embark on really dramatic redistributive agendas. So they were willing to spend more tax money on really big social programs, and they were willing to break apart old estates and tax away the money of the old aristocracy much more aggressively than the United States was willing to do. So this reversal is something that Piketty finds very interesting. It looks like my slide font changed. So another thing that I want to talk about with Piketty is his use of fiction. Obviously I would find that interesting as an English grad student, but Piketty is really interested in the way that he's really interested in the sorts of people that populate realist novels of the 19th century. So in Balzac and Austen's novels, they're people who are very concerned about how much money they have, what they can inherit, and how they can marry into wealth. And the sort of like provocation that Piketty wants to make is that it's not right to just see this as like a bizarre historical anachronism. That the world of this old aristocracy where people are simply concerned about who they marry, and this is like this is what draws out their destiny in the economic world. He wants to ask what it might be like if that became the case in the 21st century again. And you didn't read it for your readings because we've had to cut a lot because of the compressed timescale of the class. But he talks about this great scene from Balzac's Pere Goriot that I just want to go over with you a little bit. So there's this character Rastignac, who is a young, ambitious nobleman whose families had their wealth wiped out by the French Revolution, and he wants to make a name for himself, make some money for himself. And he thinks that the way to do that is to go into law, become a successful lawyer, and then retire as a famous and wealthy judge. And he talks to this other character who's an ex-criminal by the name of Vautrin. And Vautrin tells him that he's being ridiculous, that if you want to be rich, that's not the way to do it. And he goes through in careful detail and says, look, it'll take you 30 years to become a successful lawyer, and you're not even going to be making that much money. The only way to become rich is to inherit wealth. You've got no wealth to inherit, so you need to marry into it. So he says, if you are really interested in becoming successful, you need to find some woman to trick to fall in love with you so you can steal her fortune. And Rastignac is aghast by this. He says, I can't do that. That's so immoral. But Vautrin says, that's the way that you get ahead in this world. And the thing that Piketty, I think, is kind of drawing our attention to here is that Vautrin is the one who's thinking in rational terms. If we think of rationality in a really reductive, economistic way, as like simply worried about getting ahead in the world. Because if you are only concerned about increasing your income, Vautrin makes a really great point. But of course, for Piketty, there's something very historically specific about this. The 19th century, very highly concentrated wealth, and so there was something true to what Vautrin was saying. It really was the case that if you married into wealth, you'd become more wealthy than anything you could possibly do on your own. And so Piketty asks us to think about how even something as simple as economic rationality, wanting to consume more and have more money, gets inflected by historical and cultural specificities. So he has this great line, Piketty does. A Rastignac born in 1940 through 1950 had every reason to aim for a job in the top centile and to ignore the Vautrins of the day. For all these generations, success through work was simply more profitable and not just more moral. So the point here is not that he wants to just be moralistic and be like, oh, you shouldn't try to make more money. His point is that given the existence of people who are selfish and who do want to get ahead in the world, certain historical arrangements will cause them to do certain things as compared to other ones. In a world where inequality is low and the economy is booming, the ambitious people, I shouldn't use the phrase ambitious people as though that's a self-evident thing, but someone like Rastignac who's like, really concerned in like becoming, making money for himself, he's going to do something different in 1945, 1950 as he is in 1810, 1820. And so just as a final closing note for this lecture, I wanted to compare Piketty's use of Paragorio as a parable with the final text that we're going to be looking at in this class, which is the Korean film Parasite that came out last year. There's this great scene very early on when I don't want to spoil too much because it's such a wonderful movie, but the sort of scam that the main character decides to embark on, there's a similar sort of moment where he's in a conversation with another character, and there's a realization that if he wants to get his family out of poverty, the best shot that he has is to ingratiate himself with a rich family rather than try to do something like get an education. It's just the amount of money that's available to be made is so much greater by just forming relationships with the rich rather than doing anything else. So I think I'll go ahead and end it there. But I hope you enjoyed the Piketty reading. I think it's really interesting, and I hope that the story he tells and the way that he tells it can inflect our conversations going forward. So I'll go ahead and end that and talk to you all later.